In the cosmology of the slasher genre, does the universe create slashers?
That's the big question. I think it does. I think the world, reality, the universe, whatever we're going to call it, I think it prefers equilibrium. That's what entropy does. It flattens everything out into the same temperature. And to achieve that equilibrium, you have to have agents who, when necessary, step in to balance those scales to get everything even again. And the prank, the inciting incident, the crime, the misstep that triggers a slasher cycle, a cycle of violence, that unbalances things. And so when things are unbalanced, the world is like, got to get you balanced. And so a slasher just stands up from some Scottish lock, like the police say, and then rebalances things and then goes back to sleep.
I guess you can decide for yourself if justice is truly served with the slasher cycle, but first you have to survive it.
Exactly. Yeah. The slasher cycle is all about like a disproportionate response, like somebody littering probably doesn't earn them an evisceration or a beheading. That is not quite fair. But all the same, that person shouldn't have littered. The world is much more fair if they would keep their trash in their truck.
Does the universe also create final girls?
Yes, final girls to me are the antidote, the remedy, the cap on this cycle of violence. They're the slasher's silver bullet, if the slasher can be a werewolf for a moment. They are the natural antibody which fights the slasher, because the slasher left on its own will just spiral up and up, and the slashing radius gets wider and wider, and pretty soon they're trying to kill a whole city, and that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make the world better. But the final girl can, after the slasher has dispensed justice upon all the people who needed to have that justice dispensed on them, she can put that slasher down, put that slasher back to sleep.
Can a werewolf be a slasher?
For I was a teenage slasher, I say I watched Happy Death Day and Freaky a lot, but the movie that I watched, that I wrote down all the beats, all the steps, all the little micro adjustments, was 1941's The Wolfman. That was my model for I was a teenage slasher. I needed to understand how that film worked story wise. So I watched it really, really closely and took so many notes, and that completely informed how I shaped I was a teenage slasher.
In your Fangoria column, Slasher Nation, you explore many aspects of the genre, including some films that maybe operate covertly as slashers. Which famous movie monsters or celluloid villains would surprise people as fitting in the slasher mold?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've always felt like Blue Steel, Jamie Lee Curtis in the '90s. I always felt like that had a lot of slasher build to it. Lakeview Terrace with Samuel Jackson, that feels to me very slashery. And tell you the truth, I think you can watch Hostel kind of in slasher mode if you want as well. The trick is, like, what is your threshold? What's at what point does a slasher stop being a slasher? And sometimes I want to say it's when there's more than two, when there's more than a Billy and a Stu. If there's like Billy, Stu, and Robert, then maybe we're getting into another territory. But all the same, the Bruckners in Cabin in the Woods, I think Cabin in the Woods is a slasher, but it definitely has more than two slashers. So I'm not really sure where the boundaries are for the slasher. That Slasher Nation column I do in Fangoria is me kind of publicly trying to figure that out a little bit, and I think it's really wonderful that we can't quite put fences around it, that it's so motile, so in motion that it won't submit to being pinned in.
Is there one single linchpin that makes something a slasher?
Oh man, the single characteristic that can define the slasher. Yeah, I think it's lack of justice.
I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones in bookstores everywhere July 16.